They tell us about the Ottoman Empire's grandeur, its palaces, its armies, its golden domes shining under the sun. But behind that glittering image was a nightmare few dare to remember. Imagine being a young girl, torn from your home, your name stripped away, your life reduced to a number in a ledger. Inside the Sultan's harem, women were not wives or companions. They were prisoners in silken cages, trapped in a world where survival meant obedience and death could come in silence. What these women endured was not life at all. It was something far worse than death itself. Imagine being taken from your home, your family torn apart, and thrust into a world where your every action is monitored, and your body becomes a mere possession of an emperor. For the women chosen to enter the Ottoman imperial harem, this wasn't a nightmare. It was their reality. These young girls were often kidnapped during raids, separated from their families, and transported far from their homes. They had no choice, no voice, and no hope of escape. The harem, often misunderstood as a luxurious palace filled with opulence, was in fact a place of systematic control, manipulation, and brutality. Women, stripped of their identities and reduced to nothing more than objects for the Sultan's pleasure, were trapped in a world where their existence was defined by their ability to please, survive, and compete. As horrific as it may seem, this was not the fate of a few unlucky individuals. It was a system built into the fabric of the Ottoman Empire, designed to control, degrade, and exploit women for centuries. This vast network of women, living under the constant threat of violence, punishment, and psychological torment, remained hidden from the world for centuries. The shocking truth about what went on inside the harem has remained largely buried, until now. Young girls from across the empire were seized in raids, separated from their families, and sold into slavery. The process was as systematic as any military campaign. The Ottoman Empire's reach stretched far across 3 continents, and its army often targeted villages to capture young women. These girls, typically from Christian families in the Balkans, Caucasus, and Georgia, were taken as spoils of war, their lives no longer their own. The empire had a strategic method for acquiring these women, treating them like resources to be harvested for the Sultan's harem. Once captured, they were transported to Constantinople, where they were examined and sold in the bustling slave markets. Their fate was sealed as soon as they stepped foot in these markets, where their value was determined based on their beauty, age, and virginity. The empire's vast bureaucracy ensured that these women were processed efficiently, stripped of their identities, and prepared for their role in the harem. But what awaited them wasn't just hard labor. It was a carefully calculated life of sexual exploitation and constant terror. The harem was not a place of luxury or safety. It was a prison of sorts, designed to break these women physically, mentally, and emotionally, until they were nothing more than objects for the Sultan's pleasure. They were given no choice, no voice, and no chance of escape from this horrific system. The harem wasn't just a place for pleasure. It was an institution that had deep political ramifications, shaping the very structure of the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan's harem played a crucial role in maintaining and consolidating power, as it was directly tied to the lineage of the rulers. The women in the harem, particularly those who bore sons, held significant political influence. Sons of concubines could eventually rise to positions of power, becoming future sultans or important figures in the empire's administration. The harem was thus not just a space of sexual exploitation. It was a political battleground where the future of the empire was determined by which women could secure the sultan's favor and bear him heirs. In this way, the women were pawns in a larger game of imperial politics. But behind its luxurious walls lay a brutal hierarchy designed to break women down mentally and physically. Every concubine, no matter her status, was under constant scrutiny, subjected to intense psychological pressure, and pitted against one another in a vicious competition for the Sultan's attention. Their lives were governed by an unspoken rule. Only those who could survive the power games and sexual demands of the Sultan would have any hope of gaining status or security. Women were treated as commodities, their value determined by beauty, age, and virginity. In the bustling slave markets of Constantinople, their worth was calculated with brutal precision. The Ottoman Empire had a well-established system for buying and selling women, where prices varied depending on a woman's appearance, background, and perceived fertility. Young, beautiful girls from the Balkans, Caucasus, and Georgia were the most prized, while African women were often categorized and priced differently, based on their skin color and presumed qualities. Slave traders, working under the Ottoman administration, maintained meticulous records, ensuring that no woman entered the empire without being properly assessed and valued. The purchase and sale of women were treated like any other form of trade, an exchange of goods to fulfill the empire's needs. Once they entered the harem, their lives were reduced to mere objects, each day a fight for survival. These women, who had once been individuals with families and identities, were now nothing more than property, to be used, discarded, or replaced at the sultan's whim. Survival in the harem depended on one's ability to remain in the sultan's favor, and the constant pressure to please and comply turned every day into a battle for their lives. From the moment a girl entered the harem, she was stripped of her identity and transformed into a tool for the sultan's pleasure. The first step in this dehumanizing process was to erase every trace of her past life. Her name was replaced with a new identity, and she was forbidden to speak her native language, cutting her off from any connection to her family or culture. The girls were then subjected to rigorous training, aimed at perfecting their skills in seduction, obedience, and pleasing the sultan. These women were trained by older concubines, who had survived by complying with the sultan's demands. They learned to suppress all natural responses, to fake pleasure convincingly, and to endure whatever was demanded of them, no matter how degrading. The training was a brutal, relentless process that shaped them into instruments of imperial pleasure, their worth entirely tied to their ability to satisfy the sultan's desires. But the training was just the beginning. The real horror began once they were under the sultan's control. The harem was not a place of safety or luxury. It was a battleground where only the most compliant, obedient, and pleasing women survived. Those who failed to meet the demands of the sultan faced unimaginable consequences. Life in the harem was a daily battle for survival. Women were forced to compete against each other for the sultan's favor, with the stakes higher than anyone could imagine. Every woman in the harem was under constant pressure to be more beautiful, more charming, and more obedient than the others. The sultan's attention was like a scarce resource, and the competition for it was fierce. The women were pitted against each other, encouraged to form alliances that could quickly dissolve into betrayal. The slightest misstep, whether it was speaking too loudly, looking at the sultan's officials the wrong way, or even showing signs of homesickness, could lead to severe punishment. The sultan's favorites enjoyed luxuries and privileges, while those who fell out of favor were left to suffer. This competition for survival within the harem was not just physical, but psychological. Women were isolated, unable to communicate with one another, and subjected to constant surveillance. There were no bonds of friendship or solidarity, only a brutal hierarchy where loyalty could easily turn into treachery. Those who failed to win the sultan's attention faced horrific consequences, including being erased from history altogether. They were punished, often executed, or simply disappeared, their names wiped from all records. The sultan's power was so absolute that even the existence of these women could be erased with a single command. The Ottoman Empire perfected the art of psychological warfare. Inside the harem, women were manipulated into turning on one another. From the moment they arrived, they were isolated from their past lives and forced into a constant state of competition. The sultan's favor was the ultimate prize, but only a few could secure it. Women were deliberately pitted against each other, encouraged to spy on and betray their rivals in exchange for favors or small privileges. The harem was a place where trust was a luxury few could afford, and alliances could be shattered at any moment. The women were taught to see each other as threats, rivals to be eliminated in the ruthless battle for survival. This constant manipulation created a toxic environment where even the most loyal women could be turned against each other. The psychological pressure was relentless, and many women were driven to the brink of madness as they fought for their place in the sultan's court. This competition was not just for status, it was for their very survival. The fear of being cast aside, punished, or even killed at the sultan's whim loomed over every woman in the harem, making it a battlefield where the stakes were far higher than anyone could imagine. Giving birth to a male heir could mean temporary favor, but it came at a heavy price. The Sultan's harem was built on the hope that concubines would bear sons, ensuring the continuation of his bloodline. However, for many women, becoming a mother in the harem meant a shift from being a sexual partner to just another tool in the political game. While giving birth to a son could elevate a woman's status for a time, it also meant the beginning of her separation from the Sultan's bed. After childbirth, mothers were often separated from their sons as the children were raised in distant palaces, far from their mother's reach. These women, once hopeful that motherhood would grant them some degree of influence, were instead cast aside once their usefulness had been fulfilled. The bond between mother and child was brutally severed, leaving emotional scars that could never be healed. For many women, giving birth was the beginning of their decline, not their salvation. They were often relegated to the lower ranks of the harem, their once promising futures reduced to mere servitude, or they disappeared altogether as new concubines entered the Sultan's favor. The Sultan's power didn't stop at sexual exploitation. When a concubine fell out of favor, her fate was sealed in a brutal and final way. The harsh reality of life in the harem was that no woman, no matter her status, was ever truly safe. If a concubine displeased the Sultan or lost his favor, she could be subjected to severe punishment or, in the worst cases, execution. The method of execution was often calculated to be both cruel and efficient. Women who were deemed no longer useful or who were seen as threats to the Sultan's reign were killed, often without warning. The most common method was drowning. Victims were sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the waters of the Bosphorus, where they would quickly sink, their bodies never to be recovered. This method ensured that no evidence of the execution would remain, and the women would disappear without a trace. The Sultan's ability to erase these women from existence was a final demonstration of his absolute power. But even death was a controlled, systematic process designed to erase them completely from existence, as though they had never lived at all. When a new sultan ascended the throne, his predecessor's concubines were often executed in a violent purge, seen as threats to his reign. The transition of power in the Ottoman Empire was marked not only by political instability but also by cruelty within the palace walls. Concubines who had once been close to the former ruler were considered dangerous because they carried influence, secrets, and in some cases, children who could challenge the new sultan's authority. Rather than risk rebellion or divided loyalties, the empire relied on mass executions to erase these potential threats. These women, who had already endured years of captivity, found themselves at the mercy of palace politics once again. The logic was cold and calculated. By eliminating the concubines, the new ruler ensured that the past would not interfere with his future. The most infamous of these purges took place under Sultan Ibrahim, whose paranoia led to the execution of 280 women in a single night. The women were sewn into sacks, weighted with stones, and cast into the Bosphorus, their voices silenced forever. Only one is said to have survived, rescued by chance, and her story revealed the full horror of that night to the outside world. While the Sultan's actions were documented in archives, the women who survived the horrors of the harem often had their voices erased. Official records listed them like property, with numbers and descriptions, but almost nothing of their inner lives or suffering. Even those who managed to survive long enough to be freed carried a stigma that followed them everywhere. Many could not return to their families, as the shame of captivity often made them outcasts. Others lived in silence, too afraid or broken to speak of what they endured. Their identities, languages, and memories had been stripped away, leaving them as shadows of who they once were. The empire carefully controlled what the world knew, preserving the grandeur of the sultans while burying the truth of the women's pain. Generations later, historians can still find traces of these atrocities in records and reports, but the voices of the victims themselves remain faint or entirely lost. The psychological scars left on these women lasted long after the doors of the harem closed behind them. For many, freedom did not mean peace. It only meant carrying their trauma into a world that refused to see or hear them. The Ottoman Empire may have left behind grand buildings and a rich cultural history, but the human cost of its imperial system was incalculable. Behind the marble halls of Topkapi Palace and the glory of conquests lay a hidden world where women were treated as expendable tools of power and pleasure. The harem, so often romanticized in art and literature, was in reality an institution built on captivity, fear, and exploitation. For centuries, the suffering of these women remained hidden, their experiences dismissed as private matters or erased altogether from official history. What is remembered are the sultans, the palaces, and the military victories, while the silent victims remain nameless. Yet the truth lingers in fragments: records of purchases, accounts of executions, and the whispered testimonies of rare survivors. These reveal that the harem was not a place of luxury but a system designed to strip women of dignity, identity, and freedom. The psychological scars and cultural wounds it left behind still echo through history, shaping the lives of countless generations. These women's stories were buried for centuries, but it's time to give them the voice they were denied. By remembering them not as shadows but as human beings, their suffering is no longer hidden, and their silence no longer absolute.